I'm Wilder. For over 30 years, I've made my home out here in the wild, far from the noise of the city. Out here, the animals aren't just passing wildlife. They are my neighbors, my teachers, and my truest friends. I've seen how nature can test us, but also how it heals our deepest wounds. Today, I want to share a story that is both raw and breathtaking. It's about Helen, a woman who suffered a sudden, crushing loss. To escape her unbearable grief, she stepped away from humanity and tried to tame one of the fiercest creatures on Earth, a goshawk named Mabel. It's a powerful journey of losing yourself in the wild just to survive, and the hard, beautiful road back to finding your humanity. It reminds us that nature doesn't erase our pain, but it gives us the strength to carry it. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop your location in the comments. And if you feel a connection to the wild, please hit that subscribe button. Let's walk this trail together. The sky over Cambridge was a heavy, unbroken sheet of iron gray. It was early March, the kind of English morning where the dampness does not just chill the skin, it seeps directly into the bone. The wind hissed through the ancient spired buildings and rattled the bare branches of the elms lining the River Cam. It was a cold, indifferent city on a cold, indifferent day. The kind of day that gives no warning before it fractures your life forever. In a quiet, cluttered room filled with stacks of paper and the smell of old paperbacks sat Helen Macdonald. Helen was a woman carved from a quiet, intense sort of solitude. In her late 30s, she had a pale, angular face framed by dark, often unruly hair that she pushed back with distracted hands, but her eyes were her most striking feature. They were sharp, dark, and ceaselessly watchful, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime scanning the horizon, looking for things that other people missed. She possessed a fierce intellect and a deeply reserved demeanor. She was a historian of science, a poet, a woman who existed comfortably in the dusty, quiet archives of academia, but who only truly felt alive when standing in an open field, feeling the wind against her face. She was a woman who had spent her entire life observing the natural world, trying to understand the fragile, invisible spaces where human history and wild things intersected. And then, the phone rang. It is a terrifying truth of our human existence that the most catastrophic moments do not arrive with thunder. They do not announce themselves. They arrive as a mundane electronic trill on a Tuesday afternoon. On the other end of the line, a voice delivered the words that would make time stop completely. Her father was dead. Alistair MacDonald had been a giant in Helen's world. A renowned photojournalist, he was a man who lived his entire life looking through a lens, trying to capture the truth of the world. He was a tall man with a rugged, weathered kindness to his face. His eyes perpetually crinkled at the corners from a lifetime of squinting into the sun to find the perfect shot. He was patient. He was deeply observant. He possessed a quiet, magnetic charisma that drew people to him effortlessly. But most importantly, he was the man who had taught Helen how to see. He taught her how to look at a landscape and notice the invisible things, how to wait, how to be still. Now that man, her compass, her anchor to the world, had collapsed on a busy, uncaring street in London. A sudden, massive heart attack while he was working. Just like that, the shutter closed. The light went out. The world as she knew it simply ceased to exist. When you hear news like that, the world does not end in fire. It ends in ice. Helen put down the phone, and everything around her simply froze. She experienced a profound, terrifying psychological shattering. It is called depersonalization. The tea mug on her desk, the stack of academic papers, the gray light falling through the window pane, all of it suddenly looked entirely alien, meaningless. The objects in her room were just shapes stripped of their names, stripped of their purpose. She looked down at her hands, and they did not feel like her own. She was no longer Helen. She was just a hollow, echoing space where a daughter used to be. The pain was so vast, so blindingly absolute, that her mind simply detached from her body in order to survive it. She walked through the days that followed like a ghost haunting her own life, paralyzed, disoriented, and completely devastated. In the depths of this paralyzing despair, when the human world becomes too heavy, too sharp to bear, we often retreat to the sanctuaries of our youth. We look for the things that made us feel safe before we knew what grief was. For Helen, that sanctuary was not made of fairy tales. It was not made of imaginary princesses or talking animals. It was made of leather, blood, and feathers. She remembered herself as a little girl, a quiet, serious child who preferred the company of dusty library books to other children. While her peers were playing in the sun, young Helen was burying herself in ancient esoteric manuals on falconry. She had been captivated, almost possessed by the medieval terminology, the arcane language of men who tied themselves to birds of prey. These words had hummed in her mind like a secret spell. Jesses, the soft, strong leather straps permanently bound to the bird's legs. Creants, the long, heavy line used to tether a hawk during its first tentative flights in the open air. Baiting. The violent, panicked explosion of wings when a wild bird is terrified, throwing itself off the fist, desperately trying to flee its tether, hanging upside down in a flurry of feathers and rage. As a child, she had been obsessed with the idea of crossing the boundary between the human and the wild. She had learned the art. She had trained smaller birds, falcons, understanding the delicate, invisible thread of trust that must be woven between a human predator and an avian one. She knew the patience it took, but she had never, not even in her wildest dreams, attempted to touch a goshawk. The goshawk. Even the name sounds like a shadow passing over the sun. In the ancient world of falconry, the goshawk is legendary. They are the phantom assassins of the winter woods. Unlike the noble, high-flying falcons that hunt in the open sky, goshawks are creatures of the dense forest. They are notorious. They are aggressive, highly strung, murderous, and incredibly difficult to tame. They are a bundle of raw, unadulterated nerves and lethal instinct, prone to violent, uncontrollable fits of baiting. To bring a goshawk into your home is to invite a storm into your living room. It is a task that requires an iron will, infinite patience, and a willingness to bleed. And it was exactly this terrifying, uncompromising wildness that Helen suddenly, desperately needed. The human world was filled with quiet condolences. It was filled with pitying looks from colleagues, with the unbearable, suffocating reality of her father's permanent absence. The human world was where the pain lived. Helen realized, with a terrifying clarity, that if she stayed in this world, the grief would drown her completely. She needed to escape. She needed to become something else entirely. And so, in an act of what she herself recognized as sheer, desperate madness, she made a decision. She would buy and train a goshawk. It was not a hobby. It was not a distraction. It was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. She did not want to tame the bird. She wanted the bird to untame her. She wanted to fill her mind with the sheer, terrifying presence of a prehistoric predator, leaving absolutely no room in her brain for human sorrow. A goshawk does not grieve for its father. A goshawk does not regret the past or fear the future. A goshawk only exists in the pure, brutal immediacy of the present moment. It only knows hunger, flight, and the kill. Helen wanted to disappear into that present. She wanted to step off the precipice of her shattered human life and fall into the wild. She wanted to erase herself. She knew it was a dangerous path. The ancient books had warned against the goshawk's volatile temperament. But the fear of the bird's talons was absolutely nothing compared to the fear of the deafening emptiness her father had left behind. And so, with her heart shattered and her mind fixed firmly on survival, Helen Macdonald made a choice that would change her life forever. She would seek out the most untamable creature in the British skies, and she would tether herself to it. Progression through a landscape that Helen barely registered. The journey from the quiet, suffocating academia of Cambridge to the rugged, wind-battered coast of Scotland felt less like a road trip and more like a pilgrimage into the unknown. On the passenger seat beside her lay a plain, white paper envelope. Inside it was exactly 250 pounds in cash. It was a mundane object, yet to Helen it felt impossibly heavy, pulsing with a strange gravitational pull. This was not merely a commercial transaction. It was a ransom paid to the wild, a desperate bid to purchase a creature that might somehow anchor her shattered mind to the earth. She arrived at the designated meeting place, a working Scottish harbour. The air here was entirely different from the stagnant dampness of Cambridge. It was sharp, violently cold, and thick with the smell of salt, diesel fuel, and decaying seaweed. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sounding like mocking laughter against the rhythmic crashing of the gray waves against the concrete quayside. Helen pulled her coat tighter around her, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was entirely out of her element, a grieving academic standing on the edge of the sea, waiting to buy a monster. Presently, a vehicle pulled up and a man stepped out. This was the breeder. He was a thick-set, imposing man in his late 50s, his face deeply weathered and lined by decades of exposure to the harsh northern winds. He possessed the quiet, heavily grounded demeanor of someone who spent his entire life mediating between the human world and the untamed instincts of animals. He wore a faded, heavy green fleece and mud-caked boots. His hands, as he reached into the back of his vehicle, were broad, thick-fingered, and crisscrossed with old, faded white scars, the inevitable occupational hazards of handling birds of prey. He did not smile much, offering only a brief, pragmatic nod of greeting. He was not a man given to sentimentality. To him, this was a business exchange, not the spiritual lifeline it was for the pale, nervous woman standing before him. From the back of his vehicle, the breeder retrieved a large cardboard box. He carried it to the pavement with practiced ease. Helen held her breath. The moment the tape was cut and the flaps were opened, a sudden, violent thrashing erupted from within. The breeder reached in with a heavily gloved hand and drew the bird out into the harsh coastal light. It was a goshawk. It was enormous, a young bird with fierce, pale plumage and a desperate, panicked energy. As the bird baited, flapping its powerful wings in a flurry of chaos, Helen stared at it. It was undeniably magnificent, a marvel of evolutionary design. Yet, as she looked into its wild, terrified eyes, a strange, hollow sensation washed over her. There was no spark. There was no connection. A deep, instinctual voice within her whispered that this was the wrong bird. It was a beautiful creature, but it was not her salvation. The breeder, meanwhile, was frowning. He expertly controlled the struggling bird by its leather jesses and glanced down at the small metal identification ring banded around its leg. He checked a clipboard resting on the bumper of his car. A brief look of mild irritation crossed his weathered features. "Wait," he muttered, his thick Scottish accent cutting through the sound of the wind. "Wrong bird. Paperwork's mixed up. This one's the larger female. Yours is the other one." He carefully placed the giant, struggling hawk back into its box and secured it. Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The breeder turned back to the vehicle and pulled out a second, slightly smaller cardboard box. He set it down. He cut the tape. He opened the flaps. What emerged from that second box did not feel like a bird at all. It was an explosion of brilliant, terrifying life. When the breeder lifted her onto his fist, Helen's breath was entirely knocked from her lungs. She was instantly, irrevocably captivated. This was Mabel. If the first bird had been impressive, this second bird was something entirely otherworldly. Helen stared, paralyzed by the sheer intensity of the creature. Mabel was a conjuration of raw, ancient power. In her mind, Helen grasped for words to define what she was seeing, but ornithological terms failed her entirely. She looked like a fallen angel, wings half spread in a posture of furious, defiant grace. Her feathers were a tapestry of dappled browns and creams, sharp and perfect. Yet, as the bird turned her head with mechanical, terrifying precision, she looked less avian and more like a reptile, a velociraptor resurrected from the ancient dust. She was a monstrous griffin straight out of the illuminated pages of medieval manuscripts, a creature of myth brought violently into the modern daylight. But it was her eyes that truly locked Helen in place. Mabel's eyes were large, round, and the color of pale, burning fire. They were not eyes that looked at you. They were eyes that looked through you, calculating, assessing, utterly devoid of anything resembling human empathy or sorrow. They were the eyes of a pure assassin. Looking into them, Helen felt a rush of absolute terror and profound, undeniable relief. This was it. This was the blinding, burning presence she needed to cauterize the gaping wound her father's death had left in her soul. Wordlessly, with a hand that trembled slightly, Helen handed over the white envelope containing the 250 pounds. The transaction was complete. The wild thing was hers. The journey back to Cambridge was an exercise in agonizing psychological tension. Helen had transferred Mabel into a secure, ventilated cardboard traveling box, which she strapped carefully into the passenger seat of her car. The drive south took hours, and every single mile was fraught with a suffocating apprehension. The sky darkened as evening approached, turning the motorway into a river of red taillights and white headlights, a starkly modern human environment. But inside the cabin of the car, the atmosphere was prehistoric. Helen drove in complete silence, the radio switched off, her senses hyper-tuned to the box beside her. She could not see the fallen angel, but she could hear her. Throughout the long, dark journey, a persistent, terrifying sound filled the car, the dry, rhythmic scratching of razor-sharp talons against the cardboard walls. Scratch, scrape, scratch. It was the sound of confined murder. It was the sound of a creature that belonged to the wind and the blood of the forest, trapped in a temporary paper prison. Every time the scratching grew frantic, Helen's heart leaped into her throat. She imagined the beak tearing through the cardboard, the fiery eyes emerging in the dim light of the dashboard. She was terrified of the bird, terrified of her own incompetence, and terrified of the sheer magnitude of the responsibility she had just purchased. Yet, amidst the terror, the crushing weight of her grief was temporarily pushed aside, displaced by the immediate physical reality of the monster riding shotgun. Finally, deep into the night, the car pulled onto the familiar, quiet streets of Cambridge. Helen parked outside her apartment building. The air was still and damp. She unbuckled the seatbelt holding the cardboard box, her hands sweating despite the cold. She lifted the box carefully, feeling the sudden, shifting weight of the life inside it. She carried the box up the stairs and unlocked the door to her apartment. The rooms were dark, silent, and heavy, with the lingering, stagnant air of her depression. But as she set the box down in the center of the living room floor, the atmosphere in the apartment fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a mausoleum of grief. It was an arena. Helen took a deep breath, preparing herself to open the box, to attach the leash, and to begin the arduous, dangerous process of manning. She was stepping off the edge of the human world, and the fallen angel was waiting in the dark to cave, a sanctuary constructed of drawn curtains, disconnected telephones, and profound silence. Helen sat in the dim light of her living room, her left arm aching under the heavy leather of the falconry glove. Upon that glove perched Mabel, the goshawk. In these early crucial days of manning, the objective was simply to acclimate the wild creature to the presence of a human, to teach the bird that the towering bipedal predator upon whose fist she stood was not a threat. It required a stillness that bordered on the statuesque. As Helen sat for hours in the artificial twilight, her mind, unmoored by grief and exhausted by the sheer tension of holding the raptor, began to drift backward in time. She was not the first broken person to seek salvation in the talons of a goshawk. In the heavy silence of the room, she felt the ghostly presence of another rider, another falconer, whose tragic legacy cast a long shadow over her own endeavor, Terence Hanbury White. T.H. White, who would later achieve fame as the author of the Arthurian masterpiece The Once and Future King, had retreated to a miserable, drafty cottage in the English countryside in the late 1930s with a singular, obsessive goal: to train a goshawk he named Goss. Through the pages of his memoir, The Goshawk, Helen had come to know White intimately, perhaps more intimately than he had known himself. White was a man constructed almost entirely of defensive walls. Physically, he was an imposing figure, tall and heavily built, with a robust, thick beard that he grew to mask a chin he felt was weak. He dressed in heavy tweeds and sturdy boots, deliberately projecting the image of a hardy, hyper-masculine English country squire. Yet, beneath this rugged, boisterous exterior, White was a deeply fractured soul. His personality was erratic, swinging violently between grand, manic enthusiasm and crippling, drunken despair. He was fiercely intelligent, but socially abrasive, prone to alienating those who tried to get close to him. This abrasive nature was the armor of a man living in perpetual terror. Born in India to violently abusive parents who openly despised one another and their son, White's childhood was a landscape of emotional landmines. This trauma was compounded by the agonizing reality of his repressed sexuality. He was a homosexual man living in a society and era that criminalized and abhorred his very nature. Deeply closeted, tormented by desires he hated himself for feeling, White existed in a state of profound loneliness. He was accompanied in his rural exile only by his devoted dog, Brownie, a beautiful 5-year-old Irish setter. Brownie, with her rich mahogany coat, feathering tail, and endlessly patient, soulful brown eyes, was perhaps the only creature on Earth that White felt safe loving, a silent witness to her master's frantic, whiskey-soaked pacing in the dead of night. In her darkened living room, Helen looked down at Mabel's fiercely independent, fiery eyes, and she understood exactly why White had bought Goss. White was a man entirely devoid of control over his own life, his own past, and his own desires. He sought to master the Goshawk because he could not master himself. However, his methods were a masterclass in psychological projection and tragic ignorance. Relying on archaic medieval falconry treatises that he barely understood, White subjected his bird to a deeply cruel practice known as waking. Waking was an ancient method of breaking a bird's spirit through extreme sleep deprivation. For days and nights on end, White would sit in a freezing barn, chain-smoking and drinking heavily, keeping the exhausted bird on his fist. Every time Goss closed his eyes to sleep, White would jar him awake, forcing the creature to remain conscious until its wild will simply collapsed from sheer physical and mental exhaustion. It was a battle of attrition, a brutal coercive war waged by a damaged man against a terrified animal. White justified this torture as traditional discipline, but Helen saw it for what it truly was, the violence of a man who, having been bullied and broken by the world, was desperately trying to dominate something else. White's training of Goss was not a partnership. It was a hostage situation, ending inevitably in failure and heartbreak when the bird eventually escaped, trailing its leather jesses to a slow, certain death in the wild. Helen swore to herself that her path with Mabel would be fundamentally different. The era of waking and breaking was dead. Helen's approach, rooted in modern behavioral science and profound empathy, was entirely based on patience, positive reinforcement, and mutual respect. She did not want a broken slave. She wanted a willing partner. To build this bridge of trust across the chasm of their different species, Helen used the only language a predator truly understands: sustenance. Instead of sleep deprivation, Helen offered rewards. In the quiet gloom of her apartment, she moved with agonizing slowness, taking care never to stare directly into Mabel's eyes, a primate gesture of aggression that would send the hawk into a baiting panic. With her free hand, Helen carefully produced small, high-value treats to associate her presence with pleasure rather than terror. She offered rich, bloody cuts of prime beef, watching as the hawk's initial suspicion warring with its ravenous hunger. When the beef was not enough to overcome the bird's anxiety, Helen utilized the staple diet of captive raptors, day-old chicks. These small yellow fluff balls, ethically sourced from agricultural hatcheries where they were a byproduct, provided the exact nutritional balance the hawk needed. It was a visceral, bloody business, tearing the meat to offer it to the sharp, curved beak. But it was a ritual of profound care. The breakthrough came gradually. At first, Mabel would only snatch the beef with a lightning-fast strike of her beak, immediately leaning back as far away from Helen as her tether would allow. But as the days bled into one another, the geometry of their relationship shifted. The hawk began to realize that the human was not going to strike, not going to yell, and not going to force her to stay awake. Helen became simply the furniture of the world, a strangely warm tree branch that miraculously provided fresh meat. The moment Mabel finally relaxed her feathers, stood on one foot, a sign of avian contentment, and gently took a piece of day-old chick from Helen's bare fingers, Helen felt a sudden, hot prickle of tears behind her eyes. It was a fragile, hard-won victory of trust over terror. As Mabel tore into her meal, Helen reflected on the divergent paths she and T.H. White had taken. She recognized the uncomfortable similarities between them. Like White, she had fled into the company of a wild creature to escape the unbearable pain of the human world. Since her father's death, she had felt a deep, festering animosity toward society. She resented the normal, happy people walking on the streets outside her window. She resented their trivial concerns, their unbroken families, their infuriating inability to understand the catastrophic void that had opened up in her life. She too was harboring a profound loneliness, carrying a grief that made her feel entirely alienated from her own species. Like White, she was using the hawk as a shield. Yet, the crucial difference lay in how they wielded that shield. White, blinded by his own trauma and self-loathing, had tried to drag the hawk down into his world of suffering, imposing his will through dominance and exhaustion. He wanted the hawk to submit to his human misery. Helen, however, sought the exact opposite. She did not want to conquer Mabel. She wanted to be conquered by her. She wanted to leave her human grief behind, to step out of her broken self and learn to see the world through the hawk's fierce, uncomplicated, and entirely present eyes. She did not want to break the wildness. She desperately wanted the wildness to mend her. The Cambridge house was no longer a home for a human being. It had effectively become a high eyrie, a darkened cave sealed off from the rest of humanity. As the days bled into weeks, Helen's physical and psychological withdrawal from the world became absolute. She drew the heavy curtains tight across the windows, completely shutting out the cheerful, intrusive spring sunlight that dared to shine upon a world without her father. The telephone, which had once been a source of connection but had recently become an instrument of sudden, terrifying news, was violently unplugged from the wall. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic sounds of the goshawk, the rustle of feathers, the precise clicking of talons on newspaper, and the soft, tearing sounds of a predator at the dinner table. Helen deliberately avoided her university colleagues, actively hiding from the well-meaning sympathy of the academic world. On one occasion, a senior colleague from the history department came to check on her. Dr. Aris was a man in his early 60s, famously tall and perpetually stooped like a question mark, wearing a remarkably faded tweed jacket that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old libraries. He possessed a face mapped with the gentle, soft lines of a life spent safely indoors, away from the elements. His personality was defined by a cautious intellectual curiosity and a deep paternal kindness, shaped by decades of mentoring fragile graduate students. When Dr. Aris knocked tentatively on her front door, calling her name with genuine, gentle concern, Helen did not answer. Instead, she sat completely frozen in the darkened hallway, holding her breath, pressing her back against the cold plaster wall. She waited in absolute silence until she heard his heavy, hesitant footsteps slowly retreat down the garden path. She could not face his kindness. Human kindness required a human response, and Helen felt that she was rapidly ceasing to be human. Her domestic life had entirely reoriented around the survival and satisfaction of the raptor. The kitchen, once a place of warm meals and intellectual conversation, had been transformed into a macabre staging area. If someone were to open her refrigerator, they would not find milk, fresh vegetables, or any of the typical comforts of a modern English life. Instead, the sterile white shelves had become an abattoir. They were lined with heavy packages of raw, bloody beef, neat rows of frozen day-old chicks, and the pale, plucked carcasses of quails. Blood occasionally pooled in the crisper drawer. To Helen, however, this was not grotesque. It was the honest, undeniable currency of life and death. It was the only language the goshawk understood, and therefore, it was the only language Helen wanted to speak. As the days passed in this isolated twilight existence, a profound alchemy began to take place. The process of manning a hawk is traditionally understood as the human breaking down the bird's fear until it accepts the human world. But in the quiet, shadowed confines of the house, the reverse was happening. Helen was being hawked. As Mabel began to relax, dropping her defensive postures and accepting Helen as a fixture of her environment, Helen felt her own mind slipping its human moorings. She began to merge with the bird. To look through the eyes of a goshawk is to view the world with terrifying, absolute clarity. Hawks process visual information much faster than humans. They see the micro-movements of the world, the hidden spectrums of light, the minute, pulsing rhythms of prey. Sitting for hours with Mabel on her gloved fist, Helen actively trained her brain to mimic this perception. The human mind is a chaotic, agonizing place, constantly burdened by the heavy anchor of the past and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. Helen had been drowning in the past, endlessly replaying the sudden, heart-stopping loss of her father on that London street, paralyzed by the grief of what she could never get back. But Mabel lived in an entirely different dimension. Hawks do not possess the neurological architecture for regret. They do not mourn the dead. They do not worry about tomorrow. They exist exclusively in the razor-sharp, immediate present. There is only the hunger, the wind, the target, and the kill. Helen desperately surrendered to this perspective. When she looked at the world as the hawk did, the agonizing grief over her father's death simply vanished. It was burned away by the pure, brutal reality of survival instinct. She was no longer a grieving daughter in Cambridge. She was a predator, hyper-alert, devoid of sentimentality, existing only in the pure, unadulterated now. The wildness was a heavy, numbing anesthetic, and she drank it in deeply. Yet, nature is rarely a single flat note of brutality. Just as Helen believed she had completely mapped the cold, murderous parameters of her companion's soul, Mabel surprised her. It happened on a quiet, unremarkable evening in the living room. The tension of the early training days had settled into a steady, working rhythm. Helen was sitting on the floor, surrounded by discarded mail and old newspapers. Idly, without much thought, she picked up a piece of scrap paper, crumpled it tightly in her hands until it formed a small, dense, compressed paper ball, and tossed it across the carpet. What followed was a moment of profound, breathtaking revelation. Mabel, the fierce assassin of the winter woods, the creature whose very name struck terror into the hearts of smaller birds, did not ignore the paper. Nor did she attack it with the lethal, clinical efficiency of a hunt. Instead, she dropped from her perch and bounded across the floor. She chased after the rolling paper ball with an awkward, hopping gait. When she reached it, she pounced, grabbing the paper in her lethal talons, and then, to Helen's absolute astonishment, she began to toss it into the air and catch it again. She shook it vigorously from side to side, her fiery eyes bright with a completely different kind of energy. The goshawk was playing. She was playing exactly like a little, innocent puppy. Helen sat mesmerized, a genuine smile breaking across her face for the first time in months. In all the ancient dusty treatises on falconry she had read since childhood, not one had ever mentioned that a goshawk could play. They were written off as high-strung, nervous killing machines. But here was Mabel, demonstrating a complex, joyful behavior that defied every medieval stereotype. It was a beautiful, jarring juxtaposition. It illustrated the delicate, invisible boundary between brutal wildness and pure innocence. Mabel was a creature capable of crushing the spine of a rabbit in a fraction of a second, yet she was also capable of finding sheer, unmotivated delight in a crumpled piece of trash. In that playful moment, the terrifying monster Helen thought she had purchased softened into a living, breathing companion. It was a reminder that even in the deepest, most isolated depths of the wild, and the darkest, most isolated depths of human grief, there is still room for light, for surprise, and for the simple, transformative power of play. The time had come to step out of the darkened confines of the Cambridge house and into the vast, open air. Helen knew she could not fly a creature of such immense, explosive power in manicured city parks or polite suburban fields. She needed a landscape that matched the jagged, desolate architecture of her grieving mind. She chose the Brecklands. Located in the east of England, the Brecklands was a strange, anomalous region. A barren, chalky, flint-strewn expanse covered in twisted dark Scots pines and sweeping, unforgiving heaths. It was an ancient, historically gloomy place, scarred by Neolithic flint mines and the invisible ghosts of forgotten, struggling settlements. The soil here was notoriously poor, the winter wind was brutally biting, and the heavy gray sky always seemed to press down upon the earth with a suffocating, inescapable weight. To Helen, it was absolutely perfect. It was a physical, tangible manifestation of her internal wasteland, a place entirely devoid of the soft, comforting human touches and sympathetic glances she so desperately wanted to avoid. Out here, there was only the wind, the chalk, and the struggle to survive. To fly Mabel across these expansive tracts of land, Helen had to secure permission from a local landowner, an elderly tenant farmer named Arthur. Arthur was a man who looked as though he had grown directly out of the harsh, chalky Breckland soil itself. In his late 70s, he was short, broad-shouldered, and sturdily built, possessing a face deeply lined and cracked like weathered sandstone. His large, heavy hands were scarred from decades of working with rusted barbed wire and splintered wood. He wore a permanently battered dark green wax jacket that smelled of damp earth, and a flat tweed cap that shielded his pale, incredibly observant blue eyes. Arthur was a taciturn man, hardened by the unrelenting demands of agricultural life and the quiet, enduring grief of losing his wife to illness a decade prior. When Helen first approached him, nervous and carrying a monstrous bird on her fist, he didn't offer her empty platitudes or ask intrusive questions about her obvious sorrow. He simply nodded, seemed to understand the unspoken, desperate need reflecting in her hollow eyes, and pointed a thick finger toward the sprawling, rabbit-riddled heath, granting her the sanctuary of his land. Trotting faithfully at Arthur's heavy mud-caked boots was Bramble, a 10-year-old border terrier. Bramble possessed a wiry, grizzled brown coat, a snout heavily dusted with the white hairs of old age, and a remarkably pragmatic, grounded personality. Unlike the high-strung, nervously energetic working dogs of the larger sporting estates, Bramble was completely unbothered by the massive, lethal predator perched just feet away on Helen's leather glove. The old terrier simply gave Mabel a single, respectful sniff from a safe distance, snorted quietly, and then went back to investigating rabbit holes in the scrub, completely indifferent to the complex human and avian drama unfolding above her head. She was a creature of the earth, content with the simple realities of scent and soil. The transition from flying Mabel on the long, safe creance line to allowing her completely free flight was a terrifying leap of faith. When Helen first unclipped the leather leash and cast Mabel off into the freezing air, the hawk exploded into the vast gray sky, becoming a deadly projectile of pure muscle and dappled feather. In those early frantic free flights, Helen ran desperately beneath her eyes fixed on the sky, tracking the sharp, rhythmic ringing of the small brass bell attached to Mabel's tail. Helen's lungs burned agonizingly with the freezing air, and her heart pounded with a wild, vicarious thrill. In these moments, she was no longer a grieving academic. She was no longer a daughter mourning a father. She had become an active, integrated part of a hunting pack. She felt a fierce, terrifying pride as she watched Mabel expertly navigate the treacherous crosswinds, her lethal instincts sharpening and refining with every passing day. Helen deliberately threw herself into the bloody, exhausting reality of the hunt, to actively fill the massive, aching void her father's sudden death had left behind. She reasoned that if her mind was entirely occupied with calculating the trajectory of the hawk, predicting the speed of the wind, and anticipating the desperate, pulsing movements of the prey in the underbrush, there would simply be no room left in her brain to remember the man who was gone. The physical exhaustion and the sharp adrenaline became her daily medication. However, the wild is an uncompromising, brutally honest mirror, and the psychological escape it offered had a horrific, undeniable limit. The revelation of this limit did not come gently or gradually. It arrived with the sickening, visceral crunch of reality. It happened on a particularly freezing, bleak Tuesday afternoon, as the light was beginning to fail over the heath. Mabel had launched herself from the high, twisted branch of a lone pine tree, her target a large, adult brown hare that had broken cover and was sprinting frantically across the open, exposed chalk face. The chase was breathtakingly fast, a chaotic blur of predator and prey, zigzagging wildly through the dead, brown bracken and sharp flint outcroppings. Helen sprinted after them as fast as her legs could carry her, her heavy boots slipping and sliding dangerously on the loose stones. She witnessed the strike from a distance, a violent, explosive mid-air collision where Mabel suddenly dropped, throwing her heavy, scaly talons forward, anchoring them deep into the fleeing animal's muscular back. The two creatures tumbled end over end in a chaotic, violent ball of screaming fur and thrashing feathers, coming to a halt in a shallow depression in the chalk. Helen arrived breathless, her chest heaving, fully expecting to feel the usual surge of dark adrenaline, the primal, vicarious triumph she had meticulously conditioned herself to feel over the past months. But as she stood panting over the violent struggle, the protective veil of her wild, feral fantasy was violently, permanently ripped away. It was the sound that finally broke her mind's defenses. In the stark, freezing silence of the desolate heath, Helen distinctly and unmistakably heard the wet, percussive shattering of bones. It was the horrific sound of Mabel's razor-sharp talons systematically crushing the hare's fragile ribs under immense pressure, followed immediately by the sharp, sickening, definitive snap of the animal's neck breaking. Suddenly, the fierce pride vanished entirely, instantly replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of profound nausea and dizzying horror. Helen fell heavily to her knees on the frozen, unyielding ground, her bare hands trembling violently against the chalk. She looked at the bright red blood steaming as it stained the white stones, at the terrified, rapidly glazing eyes of the dying animal, and then finally at the hawk. Mabel was standing atop her kill, mantling her wings defensively, already tearing into the warm flesh with absolute, mechanical, terrifying indifference. A horrifying clarity washed over Helen, cold and absolute. She was not a bird. She was not a predator. She was a human being standing in a freezing field, actively facilitating and watching a brutal, merciless execution. She had deliberately sought out this violence, foolishly believing that adopting the emotionless, lethal efficiency of the Goshawk would somehow set her free from her crippling human sorrow. But as the violent trembling in her hands spread to her chest and throat, she realized the terrible, undeniable truth. She was not experiencing freedom. Her desperate, obsessive attempt to strip away her humanity, to become entirely devoid of empathy, grief, and emotion, was not a mystical communion with the healing power of nature. It was the darkest, most terrifying symptom of severe, untreated clinical depression. She had wandered so far into the barren, bloody, uncompromising wilderness of her own mind that she had completely lost the thread of her own humanity. She was staring directly into a violent abyss of her own making, finally realizing that if she did not find a way to turn back, to re-enter the painful but necessary world of human feeling, the wild would not heal her grief. It would completely and irrevocably consume her soul. The harsh, biting winds of the Breckland winter slowly gave way to the softer, damp breezes of an English spring. The landscape transformed, trading its barren gray and chalky white for vibrant greens and the chaotic, hopeful budding of new life. In tandem with the turning of the earth, a profound biological shift began within the goshawk. Spring is the season of the molt. For Mabel, the fierce, high adrenaline days of hunting came to an abrupt, instinctual halt. The ancient rhythm of her species demanded that she shed her old, wind-battered feathers to grow a new, strong plumage for the coming year. During this vulnerable period, a hawk must not be flown or hunted. They become quiet, lethargic, and fiercely protective of their energy. To accommodate this natural cycle, Helen moved Mabel out of the house and into a large, specially constructed wooden and wire aviary situated at the bottom of the garden. Inside the aviary, the terrifying assassin of the winter woods underwent a remarkable physical transformation. Stripped of the daily exercise and fed a rich, steady diet to support feather growth, Mabel began to gain a significant amount of weight. She grew round and heavy, her once sleek silhouette softening into a state of quiet stagnation. The floor of the aviary soon became littered with discarded feathers, long, barred flight feathers and soft, downy plumes that drifted like snow in the spring breeze. The hawk spent her days sitting quietly on her high perch, preening endlessly, a static monument to the changing seasons. For Helen, this physical separation acted as a massive, unexpected catalyst. For months, her entire existence had been tethered to the minute-by-minute survival and management of the raptor. She had used the bird's constant demanding presence as a shield against her own thoughts. Now, with Mabel safely enclosed and requiring only daily feeding rather than intensive, hours-long engagement, the shield was abruptly removed. Helen found herself standing alone in the deafening silence of her house, stripped of her feral distractions. The adrenaline had evaporated, leaving behind the crushing, undeniable weight of her unprocessed grief. The silence forced a brutal, necessary confrontation with her own mind. Helen could no longer pretend she was a wild thing, immune to human sorrow. The horrific realization she had experienced on the Breckland heath, the sickening sound of breaking bones and the terrifying depths of her own numbness, finally pushed her toward a desperate surrender. She recognized that she was drowning, and the hawk could not save her. Summoning a fragile, deeply buried reservoir of strength, she made an appointment to see a medical professional. Dr. Evans was a general practitioner in her late 40s, a woman who possessed an air of quiet, unshakable competence. She was tall and slender, with sharp, intelligent gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical, no-nonsense clasp. Dr. Evans was not the sort of woman to offer empty sentimental comforts. Instead, she offered a pragmatic, deeply grounded empathy forged by years of diagnosing the hidden ailments of the human heart. When Helen sat in the sterile, brightly lit clinic room and finally broke down, confessing her bizarre, bloody months of isolation with the Goshawk, Dr. Evans did not judge her. She simply listened, her pen pausing over her notepad, and then gently but firmly diagnosed Helen with severe clinical depression. It was a medical reality, not a mystical failing. With Dr. Evans's guidance, Helen began a regimen of antidepressants. The medication was not a magic cure, but it acted as a vital chemical scaffolding, slowly lifting the crushing, suffocating fog that had enveloped her brain, allowing a tiny, tentative sliver of light to pierce the darkness. As the medication began to take effect and the spring weeks rolled onward, Helen slowly started the terrifying process of stepping back into the human world. She reached out to the friends she had ignored and the family she had alienated. The culmination of this re-entry occurred on a bright, crisp afternoon in London, at the long-delayed memorial service for her father, Alistair. Helen arrived at the historic, wood-paneled hall feeling incredibly fragile, as if she were made of thin glass. The room was packed with people, photojournalists, old friends, relatives, and colleagues. Among them was her mother, Margaret, a woman of profound, quiet resilience. Margaret was petite, with soft, sad eyes that perfectly mirrored Helen's own, and she possessed a gentle, stabilizing warmth that drew people to her even in her deepest sorrow. Seeing her mother, Helen felt a sharp pang of guilt for having abandoned her to grieve alone while she had played at being a predator in the wilderness. The memorial service was a cascade of memories, speeches, and tears. Helen listened to story after story about her father, hearing about his kindness, his brilliant eye for a photograph, and his deep, abiding love for the people around him. As she stood in the crowded room, surrounded by the murmur of conversation and the clinking of teacups, a profound, simple truth crystallized in her mind. For months she had trained her hands to be hard, to wear heavy, blood-stained leather gloves so they could serve as a landing pad for a creature equipped with razor-sharp talons. She had tried to turn her hands into tree branches, devoid of feeling. But as she watched her mother embrace an old friend, and as colleagues reached out to pat her own shoulder in sympathy, she realized the devastating flaw in her feral escape. Human hands are not made to be tree branches. Human hands are made to hold other human hands. They are made to offer comfort, to wipe away tears, and to anchor each other to the earth when the winds of grief threaten to blow us away. Helen finally understood that her love for the natural world and her love for humanity did not have to be mutually exclusive. They did not threaten each other. She had sought out Mabel because she wanted the bird to be a mirror, a creature that could perfectly reflect and validate her own savage, isolated pain. But looking back at her time with the Goshawk, she saw the reality. Mabel had never been a mirror. Mabel was simply a bird. She was a magnificent, instinct-driven animal operating perfectly within the parameters of her own species, completely indifferent to the complex psychological dramas of the human who fed her. The hawk had not carried Helen's grief. She had merely distracted her from it. Her father was truly gone, and no amount of blood, feathers, or wildness could ever bring him back. The training of the goshawk had not resurrected him, but it had, in its own strange, brutal way, kept Helen alive during the darkest, most dangerous phase of her mourning. It had forced her to stay tethered to the physical world until she was ready to rejoin it. By the time late summer arrived, Mabel's molt was complete. She emerged from the aviary entirely transformed, her new feathers gleaming with a pristine, dappled perfection. Helen took her out to the fields one last time in the narrative of this chapter, unclipped the leash, and cast her into the sky. As Helen watched the goshawk catch a thermal and spiral upward, higher and higher into the blue, she did not feel the desperate, clinging identification she had felt in the winter. She did not feel that a piece of her own soul was flying away. Instead, she stood firmly on the ground, a human woman, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She looked up at the bird with pure, unadulterated admiration. Mabel was a beautiful, completely independent creature, belonging entirely to the sky and the wind. Helen smiled took a deep breath of the summer air, and finally, truly let go. My friends, as the embers of our campfire settle, I want us to sit with the deep truth of Helen and Mabel's journey. We often find ourselves running from the heavy storms of life. When we lose someone we love, or when the world breaks our hearts, our first instinct is to hide. We build walls, we bury ourselves in our work, or we try to become entirely numb, just like Helen tried to become the wild, unfeeling bird. But the wilderness always teaches us what we truly need to know. The poignant quote that concludes the story is, "We humans only see what we want to see, but eagles see the world as it is." In our everyday lives, it is so easy to only see our own sorrow, to let it blind us to the warmth of the people who are still here, reaching out to hold our hands. Helen had to look into the fierce, untamed eyes of a predator to realize that she was human. She learned that being human means feeling the deep ache of loss, but also the profound warmth of connection. The story ends with a beautiful balance. Pain does not disappear, but it is transformed, restoring nature's wildness and giving humanity back the capacity to love and be vulnerable. If this journey through the wild and the human heart brought you some peace today, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this story with someone who might be walking through their own dark woods. Let them know they are never truly alone. May God bless you and keep you safe on your own trails. If you believe in the healing power of love, the courage to be vulnerable, and the grace to let go, I invite you to type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for sitting by the fire with me. Would you like us to explore another true story of survival and connection between humans and the animal world next?